Simon Pickle waited in the car while Mr. Jackson nipped into a service station to buy some drinks and fetch something to eat. When he came back, Simon looked disappointed. "Aren't we going to that burger bar?" Mr. Jackson handed him the bag of goodies and started the engine. "I thought a walk in the fresh air would do us some good." A few minutes later, the Morris pulled into a lay-by at the side of a country road. A signpost attached to a wooden stile protruded from a hedge and pointed across a short field where a clay path divided it and led towards a river. Mr. Jackson climbed over the stile and waited for Simon to join him, but the boy hesitated. "You haven't locked the car," the lad said, looking quite concerned. "That's all right." "What? You're going to leave it unlocked?" "I haven't a door key." "Really? Haven't you a key fob?" The detective smiled and held up a single ignition key between his fingers. Simon raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Hasn't it got central locking? Blimey, your car's a wreck." Mr. Jackson smiled. "Don't worry, no one's going to nick it. I doubt they get it going. There's a knack. Unless they use the starting handle, of course." "The what?" "I'm obviously showing my age," Mr. Jackson chuckled. "Back in the day, these old classic cars could be started by a handle. My dear old Moggy has one. If ever the battery goes flat or the starter motor packs up, I use it to turn the engine over." Simon puckered up his face into a frown. "Huh, fancy. Don't worry, the Morris will be quite safe." Mr. Jackson led the way across the field. Small stubby crops, or at least the green shoots of something about 2 or 3 inches tall, pushed through the furrowed earth in straight regimental lines. It would be a few months before it was ready to harvest. "Wheat or barley, I should think," Mr. Jackson said, more to himself than to Simon. "There used to be a watermill grinding flour not far from here. It closed in the 70s. Simon wasn't listening. Something else had occurred to him. "Hey, have you got the gun?" "No, it's hidden under the driver's seat." "That's what I thought. And it's the first place they'll look." "Who?" "Thieves." "Don't worry, no one's going to take any notice of my car. It'll be fine. Trust me. Come on, let's have a look at the river." Simon started to walk again. He thought, for a member of the police force, Mr. Jackson was a bit reckless, yet at the same time he was sort of cool and unruffled. The man always seemed calm and in control, unlike Simon's mother or his teachers. Everyone else seemed to get stressed easily. Simon's dad got stressed and angry, sometimes at the smallest thing. If Wellington boots were left in the hallway, or there was a tiny bit of mud on the carpet, his father would lose it, get into a rage and start ranting. Simon kept out of the way when that happened, but his mother had to face his father's ugly temper and often received a black eye as a result. That was a while ago now. Simon's father got fed up with his family and left home one night. He didn't say goodbye, he just went, and Simon had never seen him again. He didn't miss him either. Arriving beside the river, they had the choice of going up or down stream, as Mr. Jackson put it. He let Simon choose, and Simon wasn't really bothered. The river wiggled and disappeared into a wooded area to the north, appearing mysterious and intriguing. The other way it straightened out, heading towards the South Downs. Simon chose north, and Mr. Jackson approved, adding they would pass the ruins of a chapel en route, as well as a deserted village. That sounded all right. A deserted village sounded pretty cool. They walked in single file through tall grasses and weeds that had almost overgrown the footpath. "The plant with the small flowers on top," Mr. Jackson said, pointing out a specimen towering beside him, "is called cow parsley." Simon, walking ahead, gave it a fleeting glance. Cow parsley was everywhere, and most of it was as tall as him. He took a glug from the can of fizzy drink he'd brought with him, and then, when he thought Mr. Jackson wasn't in earshot, he burped loudly. You should be careful not to get confused between cow parsley and poison hemlock, Mr. Jackson continued. When in flower they look similar, but should you eat any poison hemlock, you would die in a rather horrible and agonising death. Simon gazed at the cow parsley with sudden interest. If it kills you, why would you eat it? Mr. Jackson chuckled. Hopefully you wouldn't. But I once investigated a case where a woman made a salad for her husband, deliberately adding leaves of poisoned hemlock. The poor devil didn't have a clue, until it was too late, of course. What happened? He died very slowly. First his limbs became heavy and wouldn't respond. Then he vomited, and his eyesight faded. Worst of all, throughout the experience, he was fully conscious, and his wife tormented him to the end. Powerless to move, he had to listen to her bile until he passed away. Simon stared at the infinite carpet of frothy white flowers spreading ahead of him, wondering if any contained poisoned hemlock. What happened to the wife? Oh, don't worry, we got her. She's in prison serving time. But with good behaviour, I dare say she'll be out in 10 years. When she eventually dies, however, someone had better remain vigilant, because she'll come back and murder again. As a ghost? Well, reincarnated as someone else. Why do they do that? Mr. Jackson snapped off a stem of cow parsley and sniffed the white, peppery spread. Somehow evil forms in their DNA. They can't help themselves. How do you stop them then? How do you stop someone like the vicar from killing again? Mr. Jackson threw the flower into the river. I talk to them, confront them and make them understand who they really are, who they were in the past and what they have done. Does that cure them? I'm not sure if cure is the right word, Simon. It isn't a disease, it's more like an itch. What do you mean? Well, if you feel an itch, what do you do? Simon shrugged. You scratch it, of course. That's right, it's the most natural thing in the world. You do it without even thinking about it. But what if you knew that scratching the itch would result in something dreadful happening? Like what? Well, let's say you have an itchy leg, and that if you scratch it, your leg would fall off. What would you do? I wouldn't scratch it, would I? But what if your leg was really, really itchy? Well, I still wouldn't scratch it, not if my whole leg was going to fall off. I'd be crazy. I'd resist. Mr. Jackson pushed aside the cow parsley blocking the path. Suppose the leg was so itchy that you couldn't concentrate on anything else and it consumed you to the point that you would rather have the leg fall off than have it itch so much. Simon shook his head. I'd get some cream and rub it on. That would sort it out. That's cheating, Mr. Jackson grunted. The point is, ghosts that come back to murder again are like people with itchy legs. The urge to kill is like having an itch they really want to scratch. They feel that they have to, and cannot see what's wrong with it. To them it's the most natural thing in the world. That's why I talk to them and persuade them otherwise. Only when they can see why it's so wrong will they stop. What if they don't want to talk to you? Simon said, throwing a fist of grass seed into the river and watching them drift away on the current. You mean like the vicar this morning? It's curious. Perhaps he was aware of his past, or maybe he recognised the gun from yesterday and it upset him. Simon saw the path widen ahead. The cow parsley and the other grasses came to an abrupt stop, as if someone had drawn a line on the riverbank, insisting that nothing beyond was allowed to grow. The river curved like a horseshoe, and then meandered through a thicket of woodland. Set back in a large field of grass stood an abandoned chapel, small and forlorn, and strangely out of place. Mr. Jackson turned off the river path and walked through the long, unkempt grass, making for the chapel. He gestured to the field with a long sweep of his arm. This is the village of Nolly Bole. A community flourished here in the Middle Ages. Once a dozen timber-framed huts with thatched roofs and a population of 30 or 40 people. Simon scowled. He was disappointed. "I thought there were going to be actual houses to have a look at." "Ah, because I called it a deserted village?" "Yeah. During the Black Death in 1349, many communities like this were wiped out. Plague killed millions across the country, and no one knew how to stop it. There were no vaccines or medicine, and the doctors at the time were next to useless. Survivors left infected villages, often burning them to the ground. Today, only the chapel remains." Simon tried to imagine what the village might have looked like. He'd seen medieval buildings at an open-air museum on a school trip. Mr. Jackson slapped a hand against the stone wall of the chapel. "This would have been the most important building in the village, constructed by the villagers over 600 years ago. Next to the Lord of the Manor's house, it would have been the only substantial building in the area." Mr. Jackson approached the wooden door at the west end. The dilapidated chapel didn't look safe to enter. Chunks of masonry littered the ground, and a council notice fixed to the wall advised, "Danger, keep out." Simon noticed there weren't any locks or chains preventing access. Mr. Jackson cautiously entered, and Simon naturally followed. Apart from several hay bales wrapped in black plastic sheeting stacked in a corner, the chapel was empty. Unlike Marlton Church, the derelict building had neither pews nor altar. All furnishings had been removed years ago. The building was a shell. Scattered over the floor were broken roof tiles, together with a thick layer of grit and sand. Glass had never been fitted to the windows, for they were no more than slits, but rainwater had attacked the masonry, badly discolouring the crumbling stone. "Hard to believe this building was once the hub of a village, isn't it? The only person using the place nowadays is a local farmer by the looks of things," Mr. Jackson said, glancing at the plastic-covered bales, greatly saddened by the building's utter neglect. Simon was more philosophical. "Do you think the ghosts of the villagers live here? Only the dead would inhabit such a derelict place," he suggested. "The chapel has seen plenty of history," acknowledged Mr. Jackson, examining a wall of faded graffiti, "but even the local youths no longer bothered it anymore." "Ghosts can be invisible, can't they? I thought ghosts were invisible spirits floating about," Simon said. Mr. Jackson peered up at the roof, observing the blue sky through the patchwork of holes in the slate tiles. "They can take many forms, Simon. Some ghosts are as solid as you and I, while others are ethereal, like shadows, vague lights, strange mists, or a shimmering you cannot define." "You know a lot about ghosts, don't you?" Mr. Jackson crossed to the plastic bales. "It's my job, but I am learning all the time." Simon scrunched up his face. He started to wonder if Mr. Jackson wasn't just making it all up. He shot a glance to the so-called ghost detective and noticed his face exhibited a very odd expression. The same worried look he wore when first presented with Simon the day before in the police station. This time Simon's work experience wasn't the focus of his anxiety. Mr. Jackson pushed aside a hay bale that had fallen over, and a brown pair of shoes came into view. Simon moved to get a closer look, and a growing sense of foreboding washed over him. And then he knew why. A pair of feet were attached to the shoes, and legs attached to them. As he stepped closer, he saw the whole body of an old lady lying on the floor, and even with Simon's limited experience, he was quite certain the woman was stone dead. Join me again next time, and I'll read the next chapter of The Ghost Detective.